Hi, Mark Robertson back with you on Mark Robertson Talks. I'd like to welcome you to the show today. Our topic is the U.S. Constitution and how the United States has gotten so far away from the original intents of our great framers. And once again, I'm not a constitutional scholar or an expert. I'll give you an overall basic view of how we've gone around the Constitution, and then I'll send you in the directions of experts on that at the end of our broadcast today. But like I say, the country has gotten so far away from the original intents of our framers. There are so many programs brought about by the federal government, so many other actions, whether it's wars. We really haven't declared war since World War II. That's up to Congress, but we've gotten away from that as well. And much abuse throughout the history. Woodrow Wilson and John Adams tried to squash free speech. They didn't want criticism. Can't do that. That's guaranteed in the First Amendment. Freedom of speech. And there was a major assault on the Constitution, though, under FDR, the New Deal. It was largely unconstitutional. That's why he tried to pack the Supreme Court, and he was even turned down on that by Democrats. They thought that was crazy and didn't allow it. So he went into some arm twisting and eventually got some Supreme Court members to change their minds, and they allowed various aspects of the New Deal, or all of the New Deal, using the Commerce Clause and other things, saying that they could use that, and they use it as big enough to drive a truck through. They basically rationalized about anything, but they put all sorts of controls on businesses. And whether FDR thought this was the right way to move or it was just about a power grab, that can be debatable. It was probably a little bit of both, but he was basically incompetent as well. And he put controls on businesses. And one of the craziest ones that I have seen is the Wickard-Filburn case in the Supreme Court. There was a farmer named Roscoe Filburn in Ohio, and he was actually prosecuted for growing wheat on his farm beyond the amount that the federal government told him he could grow wheat. And the wheat was for personal use. He was going to give it to livestock, and even the family, or his family was going to use it, make bread and things like that. But they prosecuted him for it. So I guess people couldn't even have gardens and things like that, which is not the case, actually. But it's just bureaucracy run amok. These people, these bureaucrats in Washington trying to run the lives of the people out in the heartland who actually know how to run their lives. It's crazy. It didn't work. It's why the Depression dragged out. They went against the free market. They went against people who actually know how to run an economy, to let them run the economy on their own. They thought they knew everything. The power, the top-down command never works, but they never learn. You're always going to have these basically tyrants who want to control the lives of people. And the New Deal was a great example of that. They actually limited the amount of wheat that people can grow. They actually killed livestock. It's amazing. They killed multitudes of pigs, cattle, and things like that for, I guess, for their egalitarian approach or whatever, thinking that would help the most people, it would help raise prices. Total ignorance of economics. I mean, you can read about this in all sorts of books about FDR's folly, the Roosevelt myth, New Deal or Raw Deal, the Forgotten Man, and others. But it was a total disaster. But it's going outside the Constitution. And whenever this country goes outside the Constitution, bad things have happened. And it's not only from Democrats. President Eisenhower, good man and a great American hero. And he brought about something that would seem to be good, and it is good, the interstate highway system. But technically, that's unconstitutional as well. I mean, there's no right granted to Congress to provide funds to make a federal highway system. And the framers feared this. They didn't want to have many powers given to Congress. So President Eisenhower got around it by basically making it a Defense Department project. And Congress passed it. So it was another thing. They just rationalized it and changed words around, and they were able to get that done. And now, many of you will disagree with this and maybe get angry about it, but Social Security is unconstitutional. Yeah, they lied to get that through as well, using the General Welfare Clause. Now, the framers of the Constitution had specific words they used, and every word had a specific meaning. General welfare means for the welfare of the whole country as a whole, not individual welfare. In other words, the welfare state, the Great Society programs, the war on poverty, they're all unconstitutional. But they were able to get this passed. They basically said, well, if you give Social Security, it's improving the economy for everybody because people will have money to spend, and that will improve the economy and help the lives of the whole country. It's kind of like when Nancy Pelosi said, well, unemployment benefits help the economy. It's crazy. These people, it's like taking water from the deep end of the pool and putting it in the shallow end and thinking you have more water. It's all involved in the same government, and it's just moving chairs on a Titanic around. It's crazy. But they got Social Security. And Social Security these days, I mean, it would be a war if they tried to take that away from people. Well, look what happened when President Bush talked about privatizing a small portion of it. But Social Security is a scam. It's a Ponzi scheme. It's a pittance paid to people. If we would have put it in any sort of, heck, if we would have put it in a bank, at least we'd have it for our property. But giving it to the government is basically, you just throw it into the furnace. They say we have money and we'll be able to get it, our pittance that we need in retirement. You can't live on that. It's ridiculous anyway. But that's another thing. They try to get a mindset going that we can rely on Social Security. If people would have been planning and saving, and they would have helped a lot of people. They would have a lot more money involved in private funds. So then we'd have the compound interest and things like that over 40 years, and that would help a lot of people. And then people who were in their older age who didn't have money, there's private charity. There's always charity in the country. But the government actually gets in the way, and that too. People think that, well, government's just going to take care of it. People have Social Security. And well, first of all, everybody doesn't have it. But they use this, and it's just another example of how the federal government is out of control and how they've gone so far around the Constitution. Medicare and Medicaid the same way. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the federal government can have a program of health care for the entire nation. And I know Medicaid is more to the states, but it's still a federal program. And the war on poverty, it's been a total disaster. And it was brought about to try to control people and to get them to vote Democrat for their pittance of welfare. And it's brought great harm, especially to the African American community. It's turned our inner cities into war zones, and it's paid women to have babies if the father didn't stick around. So the government has become the father in many cases. It's been a total disaster. And like I say, we're going outside the Constitution. The Constitution was brilliant. It showed that when you go outside what these framers had in mind, there's nothing but trouble. They really, the Constitution, a lot of times, it's about free markets and the free enterprise, and value that. And it showed the value of that. And it showed that's what our nation needs to survive and thrive. And actually, another thing you'll get upset at, even things like relief after tornadoes and hurricanes, technically that's unconstitutional, but they found ways around that as well. And we all want to help people and things like that. And but there are ways to do it through the states, private charity, and things like that. In other words, all the money given to people is our money anyway. It's taxpayer money, so it's distributed by the federal government. The federal government has grown out of control, many trillions of dollars, and it's just ridiculous. It's gone so far beyond the constitutional guidelines set forth by our framers. They would be appalled at how big government has expanded and what it's reached into and how it's really stifling the country in many ways, and how they have all this power that they can do and control our lives. But even like they say, the Great Society was really a disaster that we're still paying for today, just like we are the New Deal. It's brought great harm to the country. The war on poverty didn't reduce poverty. It actually stalled the decline in poverty, and it's created poor people, actually. It has just decimated the African American family. It greatly increased the out-of-wedlock birth rates. And like I say, we're going outside the Constitution. Bad things have happened. And speaking of that, the Department of Education is a total disaster as well. The framers never intended for the federal government to be in charge of education. That's a local issue, even locally within the states, each city and township. That's where the education comes from. These national standards and things like that are a disaster. Parents, no matter where you are, if you're in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, or you're in New York City, you still want your kids educated. Good parents do. And the federal government has gotten in the way that the federal school system, government schooling, is a disaster. They threw God out of the schools. We'll talk about that in a bit. But that was a disaster. And it's gotten outside of the Constitution. And like I say, you get outside of that and disasters happen. The federal education department should be abolished. Now, James Madison, he's the founder, or the father of the Constitution, and one of our founders as well, framer. And what did he say about all this? He greatly feared this and knew that to buy votes and things like that, people in government would want to have federal programs to help people, supposedly help people. They actually trap people. But he was greatly feared this, and even in his time, people wanted to do such things, even small things. That even one time there was a story about for a pension for a widow who lost her husband in a war, but they can't do that. They said they could help him. But anyway, James Madison said, "I cannot undertake to lay my finger on that article of the Constitution which granted a right to Congress of expending on objects of benevolence the money of their constituents." So James Madison, the father of the Constitution, would be totally against Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the Department of Education, and all the great expansion of the federal government that's got out of control, that costs trillions every year. And we are a post-constitutional country, sadly. We got to get back to that. But the Constitution, like I said, gives very specific powers to Congress. And we've gone so far, though. They call them enumerated powers, very specific powers. And I'll go over these. I know it's not great to read all the time, but we'll go over these very specifically. These are very specific enumerated powers. So if they basically, Congress or the framers thought that the Congress could do anything, they wouldn't have enumerated specific powers. So they wanted to limit them, but they've gone way outside it. Like I said, I used the Commerce Clause, I used the General Welfare Clause, and it's crazy. But we'll just go over these real quickly. What do they have the power to do? The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imports, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and the general welfare. Well, the general welfare, not specific welfare, general welfare of the whole country, but they've abused that. And of the United States, but all duties, imports, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. They can borrow money on credit of the United States to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states with Indian tribes. That's the Commerce Clause. It doesn't open it up to all this other stuff of talking about farmers in Ohio and banning what they can plant. It's very specific. The trade between states and foreign nations and Indian tribes. And to establish uniform rule of naturalization. That's immigration. They knew there'd be a problem with this. They knew that the leftists would want to get more people in the country to vote for them so they could give them welfare. And so they continue to vote for them. They were very prescient. They were geniuses. And several states with the Indian tribes. And then to establish uniform rules to coin money and to regulate the value thereof and the foreign coin, and to fix standard weights and measures, and to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States, to establish post offices and post roads. Yes, the post offices in the Constitution, they're bankrupt too, but that's because of bad management. They don't have to make a profit. They can just get more money they can print from the government. And to promote the progress of science and the useful arts by securing for limited times to the authors and inventors of exclusive rights to their respective writings and discoveries, so patents. And to constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. The Constitution basically just brought about the Supreme Court, and Congress has established the circuit courts and all the other courts. And so Congress really actually is in charge of the courts. The Supreme Court doesn't even have supreme power. There are even checks with that. It's rarely used, but the Congress can actually at times override the Supreme Court. And I'm not an expert in that area, but they didn't give power to the Supreme Court. In fact, they didn't even give power to the Supreme Court to make decisions of review, judicial review. That was the famous case, Marbury versus Madison. And they basically said that essentially gave the Supreme Court the rights to decide something is right or wrong. So that power has expanded there as well a long time ago, right? Not long after the Supreme Court was established. So, to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the laws of the nations, to declare war. So the Congress has the power to declare war, but we've gotten so far away from that. The president doesn't actually have the power to declare war, but once again, they can give the president the power, and they can use words, and they get around it, and they rationalize things. And to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be longer term than 2 years. Then it says to provide for a navy. So what they're really saying here is they really didn't want the armies to be permanent. They wanted them to be brought about for a war or when they're needed, but just for 2 years at a time. So they never really intended to have an Army, Air Force, and all the other things. But as time has gone on, it's basically about the defense of the nation, and they've said that as well. Now, they thought the Navy should be permanent. You got to have these ships, and you're guarding against foreign enemies. So the Navy, they thought that should be a permanent situation. And it'd be interesting to learn more about their thinking about the armies. I mean, George Washington beat the great British powerful army with a bunch of farmers. So maybe they were thinking along these lines. But then they just came and then they went back to their farms. So they kind of thought that's kind of what they thought about. That's what they thought about people going to Congress and even the presidency. They should go serve a few years and then come back to what they were doing. But that's so far beyond control as well. And to try to get people who are in office to pass laws that limit their time in office is a hopeless case as well. So, in other words, more examples of how they've gotten out of control. And also to make regulation and rules for the government and the land and the naval forces. So basically, they could have Navy bases and things like that. The Congress limits the land that they can use for federal government, very limited. But we got all these states that have massive tracts of federal land. Even the national parks are technically unconstitutional, but the state should run the parks. There are many great state park systems. They can run these national parks as well, and they can run them better than the government. There's a lot of waste in those as well. Now, we have very many beautiful national parks, and I don't want to shut them down, but I'm just saying they're not, Teddy Roosevelt founded the national park system, and it's all great and all this, but technically that's unconstitutional as well. And let's see, to provide for calling forth militia to execute laws of the Union and to suppress insurrections and repeal invasions, and to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining militia, for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states, respectively, the appointments of officers and the authority of training militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. So once again, I guess this would be like the National Guard and things like that for each state as well. So that's kind of what they had in mind there too. They wanted to break that down to the states and only to have a Navy permanently on the federal level, and to exercise legislation in all cases whatsoever over the district, not to exceed 10 miles square, as may by cession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress become the seat of the government of the United States, and to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state, in which that same shall be, for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. So that's basically Washington, D.C. Now the big talk is they want to make Washington, D.C. a state. I don't see anything in there that allows that. That's all the Democrats. They want 2 more permanent Democrat senators. So that's out of control as well. And finally, to make laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all the powers vested in the Constitution of the government of the United States or in any department or office thereof. So the necessary and proper clause, well, the left uses that today as well to get around the Constitution. Now, the necessary and proper, well, this is necessary and proper. The Commerce Clause, the General Welfare Clause, the left uses all these things, and even sometimes the Republicans and use these things to get around the Constitution. But we've gone so far beyond the original intent. Those are the powers that Congress has. And the 10th Amendment says anything not granted to the Congress and the federal government is left up to the states, basically. And so they were talking about, well, a few years back, Obamacare, they say, well, you can force someone to buy a product even if they don't want to. I mean, you got to force you to buy car insurance. Totally different. First of all, that's a state's issue. The states can mandate car insurance if they want to. That's the state issue. Plus, you're not technically forced to buy a car. It'd probably be hard to get around, things like that. But so that's a totally different thing. And the federal government has no right to make people buy a product. That's the same with Social Security. They really have no right to force people to be in Social Security or Medicare. Now, these are far out positions these days, but it's gotten out of control. The government has gotten out of control in cost and spending, and this is why. This is why healthcare costs so much, and it's just a mess. And it all gets back to avoiding or going around the Constitution. You get into trouble anytime that happens. And there's so much unconstitutional going on. We talked about usurping the power of the states. Woodrow Wilson seemed to despise much of the Constitution. He brought about the 17th Amendment, which brought about the direct election of senators. Now, when the Constitution was established, you had the House of Representatives. They were directly elected by the people. They were the representatives of the people, and they were directly voted into office in each district. Now there are 435 districts in the country. But they thought the Senate should be different, and the states' legislatures should elect the Senate, and they would pick the 2 senators from each state. And that was just another check on power. And they wanted to give the states a lot of power. And the state legislatures, the framers gave them much power. They gave them total power to decide how to pick electors for the president and how basically to run elections. As we saw in this recent election, many of these legislators had no idea they had the power they had, and many of them, they all didn't exercise it. I mean, they had every right to pick the electors for the president any way they want to pick them. They don't even really technically have to have a popular vote in their state. If they just want to pick the electors themselves, they can technically do that. Now, all the states do have a popular vote, but the founders gave the sole power to the legislatures to pick the U.S. senators. And it's going around that has created all kinds of problems, as we saw in Georgia as well recently. There's no doubt there's a great chance those elections were stolen. And there was a Republican legislature, though a lot of them were probably rhinos, but they would have had a couple of Republican senators instead of the 2 Democrats that were somehow got into office, whether it was illegal or not. It's highly dubious ways. They had earlier stolen the previous election. But anyway, the 17th Amendment, to me, is a great disaster and one of the worst moves in the history of the country. It's really diminished power of the states and brought much more power to the federal government, which Woodrow Wilson, one of the worst presidents in our history, greatly favored. And he also brought about the income tax as well and the Federal Reserve. There's a pattern here. The income tax was thought to be unconstitutional as well when it was thought to bring about earlier in the 1800s. But eventually he found Supreme Court members that he could twist as well. And we talked about Marbury versus Madison, but the Supreme Court has made many bad decisions. These guys in the Supreme Court, people think, oh, they're brilliant. They're not. I mean, just some of the bad decisions. Dred Scott, Roe versus Wade, Obergefell with same-sex marriage, Roe versus Wade allowed for abortion, and it's just been a disaster. I mean, and the great Antonin Scalia hated the idea of basically as few as 5 people in black robes deciding a policy such as abortion or same-sex marriage for the whole country. On the same-sex marriage issue, every state, even California, had voted against allowing same-sex marriage. But they had a lawsuit at the Supreme Court, and Anthony Kennedy went with the 4 leftists, and in a 5-4 decision, they all of a sudden make something called same-sex marriage the law of the land. And even though it was turned down in every state, even California and the other liberal states, and it's just pathetic. They have no right to do that. They had no right in Roe v. Wade. Dred Scott was a bad decision. They basically didn't treat African Americans as human beings, even when they could go to a free state. So it's disastrous. And the Roe v. Wade, Obergefell, so many other overreaches by the Supreme Court. Mark Levin has a great book called Men in Black, and he is an expert, unlike me. He is an expert on how they have abused the Supreme Court, and we'll talk about the church and state momentarily. But Antonin Scalia, maybe, no doubt, one of the greatest Supreme Court justices ever, he points out, like I say, if you got an issue, he vehemently opposed abortion and same-sex marriage, but he said this should be left up to the states. And before Roe v. Wade, there were a number of states that unfortunately allowed abortions, but he said this should be the prerogative of the states. There's no way the founders ever intended for as few as 5 people in black robes on the Supreme Court to decide decisions for the whole country. It's ridiculous. It's out of control. And it's, again, it went outside the Constitution. 60 million babies killed, and it's ridiculous. And the same-sex marriage is basically the makes marriage, if you can make marriage anything you want, it means nothing. It is basically debased marriage. Marriage is between a man and woman. It always has been and always will be. And once again, this is the separation of church and state. Well, how do you know that? Well, it says that in the Bible. Well, you can't have church and state. That church and state is not, a separation of church and state is not in the Constitution, as we will soon talk about. But like I say, it's the same with abortion. And they also like to use this 14th Amendment to drive a truck through the equal protection. And I don't need to go over every case. I don't know every case, but they use that to allow for about anything. That's how they basically try to get through same-sex marriage through equal protection, where you should be able to marry anyone you want to. You marry someone if you love them. Should you be able to marry 2 or 3 people, or should you be able to marry your aunt or uncle? Or no, you can't. It's so ridiculous. Anytime you get outside of marriage between one man and one woman, it's chaos. You can't have that. It's like a democracy. It's chaos. It doesn't make sense. And then there's also, they use this to ram through abortion, the right to privacy. There's no right to privacy in the Constitution. There were actually strict laws against various sexual practices, such as sodomy and things like this. They could make laws against that, and they knew it was harmful for society. So states had every right to make laws. Now, obviously, there are a bunch of bad laws, slavery and things like that, and not allowing women to vote. But the Constitution, there's no right to privacy in the Constitution. Rights are given by God, not man. There's no right to health care. There's no right to food. And the thing is, the countries that say that's a right, they're the worst at providing such things. It's the free market again. It provides food, grocery stores, things like that in our country do a great job. And whether there are the poor, there's so many private charity efforts for food right now in the country. And I'm not saying that there aren't people in need and poor. There are. But private charity is the answer, not the federal government welfare. And that goes outside the Constitution, and that proves to be right again. And as I said before, it's very important. We are a representative republic, as Ben Franklin told the lady. We are not a democracy. And the Electoral College is a very important part of that. It protects the minority in the country. I'm not talking about minorities, but minorities, smaller states. That's why Rhode Island has 2 senators, and so does New York State. The big states and the small states. And that's what they wanted. They didn't want all the power to be in the big states. So they had checks and balances. They're co-equal branches of government. And they gave the state legislature, like I said, much power. And as we saw basically in this last election, a lot of times they weren't even aware, and they didn't use that power. We talked about church and state. The separation of church and state is not in the U.S. Constitution. And the purpose of the establishment clause in the First Amendment is so Congress wouldn't establish a religion or interfere with religious policies of the state. So all these crazy rules about they can't put 10 Commandments signs up, or you can't pray in school, it has been so abused. It's crazy. They use this wall. One of the most bizarre rulings was back in the 1940s. Hugo Black, who was a Ku Klux Klan member, hated Catholics. He was anti-Semitic, and they had this ruling come forth about a school district in back east in New Jersey, I believe, that it was the Everson versus the Board of Education, and in the town, the school district reimbursed parents of students who went to public schools and private schools, virtually Catholic, which the Supreme Court, Hugo Black knew, for using public transportation. And a lawsuit was filed saying that was unconstitutional, separation of church and state. Well, Hugo Black goes back to Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist Association, where he mentions wall of separation between church and state, which was totally taken out of context anyway, but it didn't have anything to do with it. Thomas Jefferson wasn't even at the Constitutional Convention. It's not in that. This letter was written many years after the Constitution was ratified. So it's crazy. It shows you what lowlifes and what shallowness is a lot of times on the Supreme Court. You think these are just brilliant people. Hugo Black was a lowlife. Like I say, he was a racist, a member of the KKK, and he voted against that essentially because they didn't like Catholics. So that's how the separation of church and state comes about. So that leads, we had gone a couple centuries without, not quite a couple centuries, but at least 150 years without even talk about separation of church and state. There was prayer in school. The Northwest Ordinance talked about how the need to teach from the Bible right and wrong in schools that were not necessarily religious schools. And so it's crazy. It is totally nothing, but something like that leads to the Engel versus Battalion. That's basically what took prayer out of school in 1962. There was also another one, suit with Madalyn Murray O'Hair, the famous atheist who was another low-life, shallow person, basically hated prayer and God and atheist, like I say, and she basically got prayer out of school as well. So it was a double whammy. So and they twisted some Supreme Court members, and they voted to take prayer out of schools, and it's been a total disaster. One of the worst moments in U.S. history is when they took prayer out of schools. I talked about the 17th Amendment. That was another bad moment, but taking prayer out of schools is unconstitutional. It's caused so much havoc. They took prayer out of schools, and now they have birth control. They've replaced it with that. Our public schools are crazy. You have all this transgender nonsense and everything else, and it's nonsense. And there's no mandate to take prayer out of schools. There's nothing in the Constitution that says you can't have prayer in public places. I mean, Congress opens with a prayer. There's "In God We Trust" on the coins. There's the Ten Commandments are posted in the Supreme Court. It's just ridiculous. At one point in the United States history, the U.S. Capitol, yes, the Capitol was just invaded a few weeks ago by probably Antifa and things like that, was once considered the largest church in the United States, in at least the eastern United States. So there were regular Christian religious services in the United States. And Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that letter, often attended with James Madison. And it was nothing out of the ordinary. So it's crazy. There's no way that cities or public areas should be forced to take down the Ten Commandments, monuments, things like this. Separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. Now, this is not saying that we want the president to be the pastor and things like that. They didn't want, the federal government can't establish a religion, but technically state governments can, and they have. They're not really these days, but again, the states have the authority, and but freedom of religion, it's right there in the First Amendment. So freedom of religion, freedom of speech they consider that the most important. And taking prayer out of schools, like I say, was a total disaster, and it's brought great harm to our country. And you can see it today. You don't be confused on which bathrooms to use and who can use what bathrooms. Thank you, separation of church and state. The Bible is very clear. God made them male and female. So what are the answers? Like I say, once again, I am not a constitutional scholar. But if you just look at common sense, what this Constitution was something called subsidiarity. They want to take decisions down to the local level, as local as possible, to solve problems. Now, we do have a federal government, and it is necessary, but we talked about the very limited things they can do. We didn't really necessarily go into what the president can do in the executive branch, but basically he's the commander-in-chief, things like that's his most important duty, and there's others as well that you can read about in Section 2 of the Constitution, and then you have the Section 3 for the judicial. And I'm not going to go over all that today. I'm not an expert in all that anyway. But basically they wanted to limit power, to divide power, because they so feared a dictatorship. Because throughout the history of the world, most people lived in tyranny, and they wanted something different to stop this. And we've made it almost 250 years. It's very perilous now in this country. The Democrat Party, they want to get rid of the Electoral College. They want to have direct vote, which would be a disaster. Greece had that. They folded. Pure democracies don't work. You hear the term democracy. It's used in a general sense, but we are a representative republic, and it was done to divide power, to give power to the minority, and also to make sure that tyrants don't become in charge of so many checks and balances that can stop that. But like I say, you got to have a good people for your Constitution to work, as Benjamin Franklin and the other founders all agreed upon. But you still have these checks and balances. Because basically, and you can have disagreements on this, people are not always going to do the right thing. And you got to have things in line to basically keep people in line, even people that are good people. You need things to keep them in line and on the straight and narrow. And so it's kind of contradictory, though. The Constitution is only made for a good people, but people in general are not always going to obey laws and do the right thing. So, well, how do you solve that? Well, the answer was in God. And the founders knew that our country could not survive. Not only is there no separation of church and state, the founders knew our country couldn't survive without believing in God. And that's how we take all of our faults and our failings as human beings and survive as a nation within the limits of the Constitution on the local level. The president was never intended to have this imperial power that he or she has today. And the president technically really wasn't that much more powerful than the governors of states. He just happened to be the head of the executive branch of the federal government, which had very limited powers. And now it's gotten out of control. I'm not saying that they knew that the president wouldn't actually be more influential than individual state governments, but they, like I said, we are called the United States of America. That's plural. We are not the United States, one single country. We're 50 states, and they all have constitutions, they all have legislatures, and they all run the states the way they see fit, and that's what they had in mind. And like I say, once again, I am not a constitutional expert, but I just pass along basics, and I give you some very specific places you can go to find out more information. And a lot of information I got was in the book Who Killed the Constitution? And it's by Thomas Wood and Kevin Gutzman. And it's very good. He talks about a number of ways, specifics, how we've gotten away from the Constitution. And I talked about just a few of those. There's a number of ways, though. And Thomas Woods, and I don't know a lot about Kevin Gutzman, but Thomas Woods has a great website where he talks about so many things that are how the country has gotten away from the Constitution and so many other areas that he has expertise in. I highly recommend his website as well. You learn so much. It's a schooling. I mean, it's a great education just to go to his website, Thomas Woods. And also the Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution. And this is also by Kevin Gutzman. And it's very good as well. And it basically talks about how we've gotten away from things and the fallacy of the separation of church and state and all kinds of other things. Now, I've also talked about this as well when I talked about Mark Levin, Men in Black. And it's basically about the Supreme Court and how they have often gone around what the framers intended. And then finally, the Heritage Foundation has a great guide. And I've just touched the surface of this book, but it's just basically the Heritage Guide to the Constitution. And you can't go wrong with that. It's some heavy-duty reading, and it really explains each facet of the Constitution in a very detailed way, in a way that guarantees freedom of our country. It's not a left-wing trashing of the Constitution. It's a great defense of the Constitution. And a lot of stuff to throw at you today. And like I say, I'm not the expert here. There are a lot of experts out there, but I can see that this country has gotten so far away from what the framers intended and how the Constitution was meant to be followed. And we've gotten away from that. And like I said, every time we've gotten into trouble. And we don't seem to learn that. And we got many people either ignorant or they are directly going against the Constitution and largely try to undermine it. And there are even many who want to abolish it. And we really have some evil forces going against it. But it is the rock. It is solid. It's basically very simple. It's really not even that long. But it is basically what's kept our country going for nearly 250 years with the help of God, as the founders knew. You got to have good people, and you got to have a religious faith strong in the country, or your country won't survive. But the Constitution provides a great framework if you have those two other things going for you. And thanks for joining us today, and we will see you next time on Mark Robertson Talks.